Funky classic rock.
Not only was she married to the founder and one of the pioneers of psychedelic rock, but her dad was a Pulitzer Prize nominated photographer who captured our favorite icons on film like John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, and so many others. Here to keep both her husband and father's legacy alive is Susan Joy Balin. Susan, we totally appreciate you being here, and thank you.
Thank you for thinking about Marty and also my father.
Of course. I mean, there's such a rich history here. But, we'll go back a little bit to when you were growing up. Your dad was Pulitzer Prize nominated photographer Mel Finkelstein. I mean, how incredible. He took pictures of John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe. How was your childhood growing up?
Not normal.
I was going to say.
And I think all of us would be telling the same story. It was quite amazing, actually, because when we were younger, we didn't really understand every night he came home and would tell my mother what happened during the day. And it was kind of like we were just not the normal family. And it wasn't until I was older, actually sitting on the subway going to an internship uptown, when we had newspapers that I was looking, down the line of the subway, and everybody had the centerfold open to my father's images, or they were on the front page. And I was like, wow, he's really reaching a lot of people every day. And, it was interesting. We just had a different view. Everything was very reality-based because he would come home and share what was unfolding in real life.
Do you remember that first moment that, just like you said, you were, looking at other people on the subway, looking at your dad's photos, his images? Do you remember the very first moment you realized, wow, look at what my dad is doing?
We were young because we realized that early on. My father used every neighborhood kid that he could get his hands on for an image if it was a holiday scene or back to school. So, we kind of understood that what he did was kind of tell the life story. So we got that pretty early. But as early as I can remember, my father always had police radios in his car. So we never made it anywhere, like to my grandmother's house or anywhere for that matter, without being, detoured off to him covering the story. My mother would be there turning our heads and saying, don't look, don't look. But it was definitely an interesting, thing. I think when I was in elementary school, one of the teachers invited my father to be a guest speaker. I must have been in second grade. And I was like, really? What's that about? And they made such a big deal about it. So I think we all knew something, but we didn't, maybe appreciate it until much later on or understand it fully, really. And
it goes a little deeper than that because your dad was actually part of the dynamic trio with his brother, Perry, and your mom. So tell us about the dynamic trio. What did your parents tell you about how they met and everything?
Because it definitely is historical, too. So my father's older brother by 5 years was a genius and an artist. And he took an interest in film very early on and started to do newsreel, in the movie theaters, like the little mini shorts. And he's a great big brother, and he turned my father on to photography, but they both did photography. And at one point, my uncle said, why don't you just do the stills, and I'll do the film. And he was the one who put the first radios in the car. He was so technically good at things. So
wow. My
mom was very young. She met my father when she was 13. My father was 17.
Oh, boy. That was like a scandal back then.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
They married. Mom was 17 when she married my dad. And, it was different then. It was definitely different then. But they fell in love early, and my mom was very close to my uncle. So the three of them were already inseparable, but they were very creative people. They made home films. That really were like Hollywood shorts. But what happened was my mom would be gallivanting so much with, my uncle and my dad that she began to be the one to jot down all the notes and find out all the facts. So in her own right, she was like the reporter. So that went on for many, many years. And not many, many years, because my father was freelancing at the time, and that was for the Journal American. And at one point, they were buying so many of his images, they just said, well, we might as well hire him as a staff photographer. So that kind of changed their threesome dynamic. But they were always very there and supportive. And I also grew up, my father had a darkroom in the house. He was very particular with his own work. And so, in our basement, there was a red light outside the basement door.
Come on.
Usually you never opened the door. And, when my father wasn't in the darkroom, I think my sisters and I did our share of sneaking in and looking at his images, which were very often, like at that time for a young child, some of them were quite disturbing, which is why we probably were not supposed to be in there. But, it was the news. It was spot news. It was what was happening in New York City.
New York City, too. So, of course, the images were probably, whoa, what am I looking at right now?
Yeah. I mean, there were some beautiful ones. I mean, my father was truly an artist in so many ways, the way he was passionate, and kind of serendipitous that I was with Marty because they both were two people that were very, very passionate, and everything they did was from their heart and very natural. And it's very hard for me not to think of that living on, which is what my thing in life is just to carry it on, just put it out there if you can.
And you are, and it's so amazing because, again, how I'm reading about your dad through you and because of you. And I'm interested in the fact that he actually helped to catch criminals, but he also went to the Hollywood side and he was photographing.
Research, Kiki, really good.
Well, the way you put it together, Susan, I have to tell you, is just an incredible story. And being able to view those images, again, growing up, looking at these celebrities that he was able to photograph. How did he talk to you about how he made that transition from photographing who and what the cops were trying to do to these celebrities and icons of our time?
Well, I think it starts with my father's personality and his heart. He was very sentimental, very empathetic, great human being. I when we were little, if there was a spider in the house, he'd pick it up and take it outside. He was very zen in a lot of ways.
That's what I do.
Yeah. He was very tough, too. He was all about truth and ethics and having the art of his camera, being the storyteller. So The first thing that, I think my sisters and I will all say is that he was just a very good person by nature. So to go and grab an image and to think that you're hurting somebody or getting in the way of saving somebody just didn't exist for my father. It was first, that he wanted to be there to help, and if he can capture a moment to show what was going on, that was the moment. And he was good at both. So, so that was his life. That's what he did all his life with celebrities. I remember, and I felt very upset about this, but when Princess Di had passed away, all the newspapers were throwing in the photojournalist as, they threw my father in as though he was like a, just like stalking,
right,
just like everybody else.
Yeah.
Forgetting the word that comes to mind. Celebrity photographer. My father was not that. And if he ever got any pictures that were, of a celebrity, he would try first to ask if it's okay. That didn't always work, but there was more of that happening than not. When Princess Di passed away, there were articles all over, and I did, even the Daily News had posted an article about my father being flipped by Jacqueline Onassis, which he really was. But he was also very, very familiar with that family and covered them in beautiful ways. And,
right.
He was just at this place at the wrong time. I think afterwards they connected and they spoke. But, it was very important for me to distinguish between a journalist and a paparazzi photographer. And I did, and I felt good about that. But, I think that for my father, his pride and my my uncle, my father's older brother, was very, very protective over my father. And if he read anything or heard anything, you know, he would step up to the plate right away. So, you know.
I do remember that when Princess Di had passed away, it seemed like literally the media crawled over every single photographer. It's as if they were all lumped into one category, which obviously is not the truth. So that must have been hard for you to read about.
Yeah. Well, I wrote to, at the time I was living in the Tampa Bay area, so I wrote to the St. Pete Times, which then got picked up by the New York Press Photographers Association and then by the Daily News. So it kind of traveled enough to say, hey, why would you do that to, you know, the guys that are out in the street risking their lives every day? It's not okay. So, you know, I mean, you can speak up and do what you can, but, you know, life is full of a lot of different moments where some fairness doesn't surface to the top. But he was definitely a very unique, caring human being. And he was, I kid around, but it's true. He was tough out in the street. He always worked out. He always, you know, kind of had a sense of, you know, wanting to be able to handle if he came up against somebody, you know, that was going to threaten him. So he was tough, but at home, he was definitely a big baby. So, my mother, I give my mother really the credit. My sisters and I say all the time, like, you know, she pushed him out the door and said, you'll live, just get by the day, you know, be careful, get by the day.
Wow.
He really had a lot of love and support from his family, and my mother was an incredible person because she put up with a lot. You know, we would be up. You know, I remember going to sleep at night during, you know, the civil rights movement and all the rioting. And, you know, my mom would be glued to the TV, and it wasn't like we have 24 coverage now.
Right.
You know, making sure that he came home safe. Or, you know, and my father was also, he wanted to tell a story. He wanted to get the perspective of the reality of what was happening. And so he helped a lot of people. He did, you know, I mean, that was his thing.
And it is funny that you say he had that tough exterior, because I did watch when he was on To Tell the Truth. I loved that show. And your dad, honestly, I would be afraid.
Yeah, you know, and it's very funny because we went, I think I was in 7th grade. The family went. We were in the audience.
Were you really?
We were hysterical. I don't even know, you know, to see two other men saying that they're Mel Finkelstein, and to see my father keep a straight face. I don't know why he had us come, because we could see a few times where, you know, he was purposely not looking at us. But it really, yeah, you know, I mean, he was tough. Yeah. I mean, like that side of him when it came to justice or what was truthful or right, you didn't mess with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to say, you know, you spoke about the Jackie Onassis picture. Did he talk about that? Was that the one thing he would always bring up around the dinner table, or was there just different things he would like to talk about? Or was there one memory from your dad that just stuck with him?
We didn't have a normal dinner table because he always came in late, or in the early days he worked through the night. But he was always talking. It was his life. So no matter who was there, you know, the stories were shared. He felt very connected to the Kennedy family. He was friends with Bobby Kennedy, who had an interest in photography and would, you know, come into the city and drive around in my dad's, you know, in the beginning it was the newspaper, you know, radio car. But my father always felt very connected to the Kennedys, and in particular to Jackie. So it was kind of a weird thing that happened with, you know, I'm Curious Yellow and her coming out of the theater.
Right.
It was just also blown out of proportion, but he did very much. So I grew up with pictures of the Kennedys all over. You know, we had a den, a family room, and my mom hung all of my father's photos up there. And, you know, I thought that they were just like part of our family.
Wow.
You know, as a child, I was like, you know, just like family portraits. So, you know, I was in Italy with my sister when I was 17. We were in the Sistine Chapel, and Caroline was there, and my sister and I looked at each other and we were like, we felt like we wanted to go and say, you've been hanging in our den all of our lives. Not her father, her brother, but of course we didn't. But, my father felt, very connected and compassionate to the people that he photographed, whether it was for a lengthy period of time that he got to know them. He knew Joe Namath very well. He knew a lot of people very well, but he was very quiet about it, and he just did his thing. But I do, I think that if there was any one image in particular, I can't really pick one, that would come to mind, because he really was so invested and so passionate about just being out in the streets all the time.
Yeah.
Covering things he was at CBGB's the first day it opened, and boy, he hung out on the east side of New York a lot. He'd wake up. We'd tease him when we got, my sisters and I were old enough to understand, he would drive into the city. He always had a small sports car so that he could get in and out of spaces.
Yeah.
And it always got run over by one of the news trucks. That was like the joke in our family. But, he had his radios on all the time, and he would be in his car, and everybody, the newspaper just said, leave Mel out there, let him do his thing. And he would just be all over the city, human interest stories, breaking news, fires, but he always caught it from a different perspective. So, tenement fires were very big in the 70s and early 80s, and, he wouldn't just get a typical fire. He'd be up in a helicopter shooting down and see, one of his, I think his favorite shots actually was this older man standing on his rooftop throwing a bucket of water.
Oh my God.
It was a huge fire in the building next door, as though the water was going to put it out. My father just looked for the other kind of angle of the story. So. And
he used to talk people down off of ledges too, I read.
Yes. He definitely did. And in fact, every day I'm trying to go through some of his images that are digitized already. But we have a lot of work. My sisters and I were working on digitizing all of his images. But just the other day, I was looking at the entire roll of film it was titled "A Would-Be Jumper" from the Brooklyn Bridge. And, the one picture that makes it into the paper was one thing, but the others that led up to it or that weren't chosen, were also telling. And it blew me away looking at it.
I just got the chills when you said that. I mean, I can only imagine what you all have to look at from your dad.
Yeah, it's a lot, It is. But I feel that, when you think about it, it's history.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing like a visual image storytelling.
Right.
What would, like our history books be like? I only liked the ones with the images in it.
Of course.
So I don't know. It's something that really shouldn't be kept on the shelf.
Nope.
Collecting dust. It needs to be out.
You're absolutely right. And your dad was at Woodstock. Now that to me is just so amazing. And what stories did he tell you about being at Woodstock?
Well, I think the biggest story was how he came home. He didn't even have to open his mouth. In the late 60s, Woodstock took place. The journalists were wearing, suits with thin black ties. My father, had a white man-tailored shirt. That's how you went to work. He came home. His white shirt was cut at the shoulders, so it was all frayed. He had somebody else's shorts on. He had water buffaloes, the buffalo sandals.
Yeah.
He was unshaven and was very happy. And not long after, we noticed some funky plants growing in the garden. So it changed him.
That is crazy. Totally crazy.
But he felt like it was a great gathering. I remember, it was very interesting because as his daughters, because of seeing so many terrible things, he was very, on a certain level ahead of most parents and knowing what to watch out for.
Yeah.
And what to be wary of. So on one hand, that was not a good thing in terms of being his daughter and thinking that, he's always going to be overprotective and worried. But he was also very open-minded, and because he saw so many things kind of work out, like Woodstock, like that the kids were great, they got along, that, he was so impressed with that. So, so on the other hand, there was this very open-minded man that kind of was less conservative than most of my friends' fathers. So it was very, a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Which, definitely adds up to and equates to, and like you said, an interesting childhood and teenage years. So you're very fortunate you were able to experience all of this. And I have to tell you the most coincidental thing. Now, I've interviewed several people, but I thought that this piece is the most ironic piece I think I've come across yet. Now, your dad, he's there at Woodstock. He photographed many images at Woodstock. He photographed also Jefferson Airplane. And then years later, you're married to the founder of Jefferson Airplane and one of the originators of psychedelic rock.